There is a place that appears again and again across the pages of Scripture. A place with no cities, no temples, no crowds, no applause, only wind, only stone, only silence. It is the wilderness. And if you read the Bible carefully, something strange begins to emerge. The wilderness is where Moses loses 40 years of his life. It is where Israel wanders in circles. It is where David hides while being hunted. It is where Elijah collapses in exhaustion. It is where John the Baptist lives alone. And it is where Jesus is led immediately before beginning his public ministry. At first glance, these stories seem unrelated. Different people, different centuries, different circumstances, but they all share the same setting, the same landscape, the same uncomfortable destination, the wilderness. Most people assume the wilderness is a place of punishment, a place of failure, a place where plans fall apart and prayers seem to echo back unanswered. And sometimes it certainly feels that way. But here is the detail most readers miss. In story after story, God is not rescuing people from the wilderness. He is leading them into it. That pattern appears so often that eventually it forces a question. Not why people end up there, but why God keeps sending them there. Because if the wilderness is merely a place of loss, then why does it become the meeting place of some of the most important moments in the entire Bible? And once you notice that question, the wilderness begins to look like something very different from what most people imagine. The question becomes difficult to ignore. Why does God keep sending people into the wilderness? Because if the wilderness were simply a place of punishment, the pattern would not make sense. Moses enters the wilderness before discovering his calling. Israel enters the wilderness after being delivered. David enters the wilderness before becoming king. Elijah enters the wilderness after one of the greatest victories of his life. Jesus enters the wilderness immediately after his baptism. Notice the sequence. Not failure and then wilderness. Very often, it is obedience and then wilderness. And that changes the way we read these stories. Most people imagine the spiritual life as a straight line. Faithfulness leads to blessing. Blessing leads to clarity. Clarity leads to purpose. But the Bible repeatedly interrupts that expectation. Again and again, God does something unexpected. He takes people away from the places that seem productive, away from stability, away from certainty, away from everything familiar. And then he brings them into a landscape that appears empty. No resources, no obvious direction, no visible progress. A place where every distraction begins to disappear. That is why the wilderness feels so unsettling, because it strips away the things we normally use to measure success. But here is the detail that becomes impossible to miss. The wilderness is almost never the end of the story. It is usually the place just before the story changes, just before the covenant, just before the calling, just before the kingdom, which raises an even deeper question. What if the wilderness is not where God is absent? What if it is the place he intentionally uses to prepare people for what comes next? And if that is true, then we need to understand what the wilderness actually meant to the people who first read these stories. To understand why the wilderness appears so often in Scripture, we need to slow down and look at a word. Because sometimes an entire idea is hidden inside a single ancient term. In English, the Bible usually translates it as wilderness. A barren place, a desert, an empty land, and that is not wrong. But it is not the whole story. The Hebrew word is midbar, and at first glance, it seems straightforward. A wilderness is simply a wilderness. But here is the detail most readers never notice. The word midbar appears to be connected to another Hebrew word, dabar, and dabar means word, or speech, or to speak. Now, scholars debate exactly how direct that connection is. But ancient Jewish readers noticed something remarkable. The place of the wilderness and the place of speaking seem to overlap again and again throughout the biblical story. Think about it. Where does Moses hear the voice from the burning bush? In the wilderness. Where does Israel receive the law? In the wilderness. Where does Elijah hear the still small voice? In the wilderness. Where does John begin his ministry? In the wilderness. Where is Jesus confronted, tested, and prepared. In the wilderness, the pattern repeats so many times that it stops feeling accidental, and something begins to emerge. The wilderness is not merely a place where people wander. It is a place where competing voices begin to disappear. No crowds, no kingdoms, no distractions, no endless noise, just silence. And in that silence, people hear things they could not hear anywhere else. That may be why the wilderness feels so uncomfortable, because most of us would rather receive direction without losing control. We would rather hear God's voice without entering the lonely places. But throughout Scripture, the two are often connected. And once you see that connection, the story of Moses begins to look very different. The story begins with a man who thought his life was over. Moses was once a prince of Egypt, raised in the most powerful empire on earth. Educated, privileged, positioned close to the center of power. If anyone looked destined for greatness, it was him. And then everything collapsed. One act of violence, one exposed secret, one moment of fear, and Moses fled into the wilderness. At first, it looks like a story about failure. A man running from the consequences of his actions. A fugitive hiding at the edge of civilization. For 40 years, nothing remarkable seems to happen. No miracles, no prophecies, no public ministry. Just sheep, just sand, just silence. But here is what most people miss. Those 40 years are not a pause in the story. They're the story, because the wilderness is doing something to Moses that Egypt never could. Egypt taught him how to rule. The wilderness taught him how to listen. Egypt taught him power. The wilderness taught him dependence. Egypt taught him who he could become. The wilderness taught him who he was without any of it. And then, after 4 decades of obscurity, something impossible happens. A bush catches fire, but it does not burn up. And in the middle of that wilderness, God speaks. Notice where the revelation occurs. Not in Pharaoh's palace, not in a temple, not in a city, in the wilderness. The very place that appeared empty becomes the place filled with presence. And suddenly the scale of the story begins to expand. This is no longer merely about Moses. It is about a pattern. The wilderness is not just a location on a map. It is a place where identities are stripped away, where noise is reduced, where human strength reaches its limits, and where God often begins speaking, but the pattern grows larger still. Because Moses is not the only one. Israel will enter the wilderness. David will enter the wilderness. Elijah will enter the wilderness. John the Baptist will emerge from the wilderness. Even Jesus will be led into the wilderness. The same landscape appears again and again, not as an accident, not as a backdrop, but as part of the architecture of the biblical story itself. And that changes everything. Because if the wilderness keeps appearing before moments of calling, covenant, and transformation, then perhaps it was never merely a place of survival. Perhaps it was a place of preparation. And Moses was only the beginning. And Moses was only the beginning. Because once you start looking for the wilderness, you begin to see it everywhere. It appears so often that eventually a question emerges. Could all of these stories be connected? Not connected because they happen in the same geography. Not connected because they share the same climate. Connected because they reveal the same process. A process God seems to repeat across centuries, across covenants, across generations. And that is exactly what we are going to explore. We are going to follow the wilderness through the entire biblical story, not as a place, but as a pattern. We will watch an entire nation leave Egypt only to spend decades in the desert. We will watch a future king hide in caves while his destiny seems to disappear. We will watch a prophet collapse beneath the weight of exhaustion and discover that God speaks most clearly when every other voice has fallen silent. We will watch a man dressed in camel's hair emerge from the wilderness and announce that history is about to change. And we will watch Jesus himself enter the wilderness before he begins the mission that would transform the world. At first, these stories seem separate. Different people, different struggles, different centuries. But by the end, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. Again and again, the wilderness appears between what was and what will be, between slavery and freedom, between obscurity and calling. between weakness and strength, between identity received from the world and identity received from God. That is the framework we need to keep in mind, because the Bible is not presenting the wilderness as a random hardship. It is presenting it as a transition, a threshold, a place where one version of a person ends and another begins. And once that pattern becomes visible, some of the most confusing seasons in Scripture suddenly start making sense. So let us leave Moses standing beside the burning bush for a moment and follow the story forward. Because the next wilderness is larger than one man. It involves an entire nation, and it may reveal more clearly than any other story why God sometimes leads people into places they would never choose for themselves. The next wilderness is larger than one man, much larger, because now the story is no longer about Moses learning to listen. It is about an entire nation learning to trust, and that turns out to be far more difficult. The year is somewhere around the 13th century before Christ. For generations, the Israelites had lived in Egypt, at first as honored guests, later as slaves. Their fathers had been born there. Their grandfathers had been born there. Many had never seen another home. Egypt was not merely where they lived. Egypt was the world they understood. Its rhythms shaped their days. Its economy fed their families. Its gods stood in every direction they looked. And then God shattered that world. The Nile turned to blood. Darkness covered the land. The firstborn died. Pharaoh finally released them. And suddenly they were free. At least physically. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because leaving Egypt took one night. But removing Egypt from their hearts would take far longer. Notice what happens next. God parts the Red Sea. An entire nation walks through on dry ground. One of the most spectacular miracles in Scripture. And if you were writing the story, you would probably send them straight to the Promised Land. Direct route, quick victory, immediate fulfillment. But God does the opposite. He leads them into the wilderness. That detail appears so strange that the text itself pauses to explain it. The shortest route existed. There was an easier road, a faster road, a more logical road. Yet God deliberately avoided it. Why? Because the wilderness was not a detour. The wilderness was the destination, at least for a season. And here the story begins to reveal something profound about the way God works. Most people want transformation without transition, promise without process, victory without preparation. But Scripture repeatedly joins those things together. God often gives the promise first, then sends people into the wilderness between the promise and the fulfillment. The wilderness becomes the bridge, the place in between, the place where old identities die before new identities emerge. And nowhere is that pattern more visible than Israel. Think about the psychology of these former slaves. For 400 years, they had lived under oppression, generation after generation. Imagine what that does to a people. Their habits, their fears, their assumptions, their understanding of themselves. Even after the chains are removed, something remains. The mindset survives. The slavery continues internally. That is why freedom can be terrifying. Slavery is painful, but at least it is familiar. The wilderness is different. The wilderness forces uncertainty. No predictable system. No visible security. No familiar structure. Only dependence. And dependence is uncomfortable. Perhaps that is why the Israelites keep looking backward. Again and again they complain. Again and again they remember Egypt. Not the whips, not the oppression, not the cruelty, the food, the certainty, the familiarity. Notice how selective memory becomes in moments of fear. The past suddenly appears better than it really was. The wilderness exposes that tendency, and that exposure is part of its purpose. Because what the wilderness reveals cannot remain hidden forever. This becomes one of the major patterns throughout Scripture. The wilderness uncovers what already exists beneath the surface. Fear becomes visible. Pride becomes visible. Distrust becomes visible. Faith becomes visible. Character becomes visible. Not because the wilderness creates those things, because it reveals them. A storm reveals weaknesses in a house. The storm did not create the cracks. The cracks were already there. The wilderness functions the same way. And now the story becomes even more interesting, because the wilderness is not only a psychological space, it is also a theological space, a place where God begins rebuilding an entire people from the ground up. Consider everything Israel receives there: the covenant, the law, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, the manna, the visible presence of God. Almost everything that defines Israel as a nation emerges in the wilderness. That is extraordinary, because when most people imagine spiritual formation, they imagine classrooms. The Bible repeatedly chooses deserts. Again and again, God teaches in places that appear empty. But here is where the ancient language adds another layer. The Hebrew word often translated as test is neza. It appears repeatedly throughout the wilderness narratives. Modern readers sometimes misunderstand this word. They hear the word test and imagine an examination designed to make someone fail. That is not the primary idea. In ancient Hebrew thought, neza carries the sense of proving, revealing, bringing something into the open, like precious metal entering fire. The fire is not creating the gold. The fire reveals what the gold already is. That changes how we read the wilderness. God is not simply punishing Israel. He is revealing Israel, revealing their fears, their loyalties, their desires, their trust, and perhaps most importantly, revealing himself. Because every crisis in the wilderness becomes an opportunity for revelation. No water, then God provides water. No food, then God provides manna. No direction, then God provides a pillar of cloud. No protection, then God provides victory. The pattern repeats so often that eventually a larger truth emerges. The wilderness is not merely exposing human weakness. It is revealing divine faithfulness. Both things are happening simultaneously, and that dual revelation changes everything. Because most people assume the wilderness is about discovering who they are. In Scripture, it is equally about discovering who God is. Israel learns things about God in the wilderness that could never have been learned in Egypt. Not because God changed, because their circumstances changed. Certain aspects of God's character only become visible when human resources disappear. Provider, guide, protector, sustainer. These are not abstract theological concepts. They're discoveries made in moments of need. And the wilderness creates those moments. Which brings us to a detail that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The wilderness is repeatedly associated with dependence. Manna appears every morning. Only enough for the day. No stockpiling. No ordin. No long-term security. Tomorrow's provision arrives tomorrow. Not today. That arrangement forces trust. Every sunrise becomes an act of dependence. Every meal becomes an act of dependence. Every day becomes an exercise in faith. And perhaps that is why the wilderness feels so uncomfortable to modern readers. Because dependence is not something most of us naturally seek. We prefer control, predictability, self-sufficiency. Yet the wilderness dismantles those illusions, one layer at a time, until people discover what remains when everything else has been removed. And that may be the deepest lesson Israel learns. The wilderness is not fundamentally about survival. It is about relationship. God is not merely moving a nation from one geographic location to another. He is teaching them how to know Him, how to trust Him, how to walk with Him, how to depend on Him. The journey is longer than anyone expected. The process is harder than anyone wanted. But by the end, the wilderness has become something entirely different from what it appeared to be at the beginning. Not a place of abandonment, a place of formation. Not a place where God disappeared, a place where He became impossible to ignore. And once you see that pattern in Israel, another question begins to emerge. Because the wilderness does not only shape nations, it shapes individuals, kings, prophets, future leaders. Again and again, before God entrusts someone with influence, He first leads them into isolation. And nowhere is that pattern clearer than in the lives of David and Elijah. And nowhere is that pattern clearer than in the lives of David and Elijah. At first glance, they could not be more different. One is a future king, the other is a prophet, One spends years running from an enemy. The other collapses after defeating one. One enters the wilderness before receiving the throne. The other enters it after experiencing one of the greatest victories in biblical history. Different stories, different circumstances, different centuries, yet both arrive in the same place, the wilderness. And what happens there reveals something remarkable about why God keeps bringing people into these lonely spaces. Let us begin with David. Most people remember David as a king, the giant slayer, the writer of Psalms, the ruler of Israel's golden age. But David spent far more time in the wilderness than he ever spent on the throne. And that detail matters, because before David became king, he became a fugitive. The story unfolds shortly after his victory over Goliath. Everything seems to be moving in the right direction. The nation celebrates him. Songs are written about him. His reputation spreads throughout Israel. If you were reading the story for the first time, you would assume the next chapter involves promotion, recognition, success. Instead, it becomes a story about hiding. King Saul becomes consumed by jealousy. The man who once welcomed David into his court now wants him dead. And suddenly David is running for his life. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. Years spent moving through caves, mountains, deserts, and wilderness strongholds. Years spent sleeping under open skies. Years spent looking over his shoulder. Years spent waiting for promises that seem increasingly impossible. Pause for a moment and consider the psychological weight of that experience. David had already been anointed king. The promise had already been spoken. Samuel had poured oil on his head. The future appeared certain, and yet reality looked completely different. That tension sits at the center of many wilderness stories. The promise exists. The fulfillment does not. God has spoken. Circumstances disagree, and the wilderness becomes the place where people must decide which voice they trust. This may explain why so many of David's psalms emerge from wilderness settings. The Psalms are not abstract theology. They are prayers forged under pressure, songs born in caves, cries lifted from desert strongholds, questions asked while hiding among rocks. And those questions sound surprisingly human. How long, O Lord? Why do you stand far away? Will you forget me forever? These are not the words of someone sitting comfortably on a throne. They are the words of someone learning to trust God when visible evidence seems absent. And here another layer appears. The Hebrew word often translated trust is batach. Its meaning is richer than modern readers often realize. It carries the sense of confidence, security, reliance. The image is not merely believing something is true. It is resting your weight upon it, leaning your future upon it, depending upon it. And that is exactly what the wilderness forces David to do. Because every other source of security keeps disappearing. Position disappears. Comfort disappears. Predictability disappears. Control disappears. Only trust remains. And perhaps that is why David emerges from the wilderness as a different man than the one who entered it. The wilderness does not merely protect him from Saul. It prepares him for leadership. Because ruling Israel required more than military skill, more than charisma, more than courage. It required dependence upon God. The very lesson the wilderness had been teaching him all along. But before we move on, notice something important. David repeatedly has opportunities to kill Saul. Twice he could end the story. Twice he could force the promise into existence. Twice he could take the shortcut, and twice he refuses. Why? Because the wilderness has already taught him something. God's promises do not need human manipulation to survive. That lesson may be one of the most valuable gifts the wilderness ever gives. Learning to wait, learning not to force, learning not to seize what God has not yet given. And that brings us to Elijah. If David represents the wilderness before success, Elijah represents the wilderness after success, which may be even more surprising. Because when most people imagine spiritual exhaustion, they imagine failure causing it. Elijah's story challenges that assumption. His collapse happens immediately after victory. The setting is Mount Carmel, one of the most dramatic confrontations in Scripture. Hundreds of prophets of Baal, a nation watching, fire falling from heaven. a miraculous display of divine power. By every visible measure, Elijah has won. The false prophets are defeated. The people acknowledge God. The drought is ending. Everything appears successful. And then something strange happens. One threat arrives, a message from Queen Jezebel, and Elijah runs. The great prophet flees into the wilderness. At first, this seems irrational. How can a man who just witnessed fire from heaven be terrified by a single threat? But the story becomes far more understandable when viewed through a human lens. Because spiritual victories do not eliminate human limitations. Prophets still become exhausted. Leaders still become discouraged. Faithful people still reach their limits. And Elijah has reached his. The text describes him sitting beneath a broom tree, alone, drained, overwhelmed. Then he says something deeply revealing. It is enough. Take away my life. I cannot continue. Notice how different this wilderness looks from David's. David's wilderness revolves around fear. Elijah's wilderness revolves around exhaustion. David wonders if God will fulfill his promise. Elijah wonders if continuing is worth it. Different struggles. Same landscape. And then something beautiful happens. God meets him there. Not with condemnation. Not with rebuke. Not with anger. First comes rest. Food. Water. Sleep. That sequence is worth noticing. Before God addresses Elijah's theology, he addresses Elijah's humanity. The exhausted prophet does not first receive a sermon. He receives nourishment. That detail alone reveals something profound about God's character. But the story goes deeper, because eventually Elijah arrives at Horeb, the mountain of God, and there another revelation occurs. A powerful wind tears through the mountains. But God is not in the wind. An earthquake follows. God is not in the earthquake. Fire appears. God is not in the fire. Then comes what many translations call a still small voice. The Hebrew expression is fascinating, called dimmadaka, literally something closer to a voice of thin silence, a delicate stillness, a whisper-like quiet. The phrase itself feels paradoxical, a voice made of silence. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The wilderness strips away noise until people can hear what could not be heard before. Not because God was absent previously, because everything else was louder. And suddenly David and Elijah begin to look like two versions of the same story. One enters the wilderness carrying fear. The other enters carrying exhaustion. One is waiting for a future. The other is recovering from the past. One needs trust. The other needs renewal. Yet both encounter God there. Both emerge changed. Both discover that the wilderness is not merely where things are lost. It is where deeper things are found. Identity, dependence, clarity, perspective. And as significant as these stories are, the pattern is still expanding. Because soon the wilderness will become more than a place of preparation for kings and prophets. It will become the launching point for an announcement that changes the course of history. And that announcement begins with a solitary voice crying out from the desert. And that announcement begins with a solitary voice crying out from the desert. By the time we reach the opening pages of the New Testament, centuries have passed since the days of David and Elijah. Empires have risen. Empires have fallen. Prophets have spoken. And then, for generations, silence. No new prophetic voice. No new revelation. The story seems suspended. And then, suddenly, the wilderness appears again. Not Jerusalem. Not Rome. Not the temple courts. The wilderness. A man emerges wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey. John, the Baptist. And the location is not accidental. Because John's message is not merely being delivered in the wilderness. The wilderness is part of the message. Just as Israel once entered the wilderness before becoming God's covenant people, John calls Israel back into the wilderness before the arrival of the Messiah. The pattern is repeating. A new beginning is coming. A new exodus. A new chapter in the story. And it starts in the same place it always seems to start. The wilderness. Then comes the most surprising example of all. Jesus himself. Immediately after his baptism, something remarkable happens. The gospel writers are careful with their wording. Jesus is not accidentally lost in the wilderness. He is led there. In Matthew's account, he is led by the Spirit. In Luke's account, he is led by the Spirit. The detail is repeated because it matters. The wilderness is not evidence of divine absence. It is evidence of divine direction. For 40 days, Jesus walks where Israel once walked. He experiences hunger, isolation, testing, temptation, and suddenly the entire biblical pattern comes into focus. Moses, Israel, David, Elijah, John, Jesus, different stories, one architecture. Again and again, the wilderness appears between the old life and the new one, between calling and fulfillment, between promise and purpose, between who a person was and who they are becoming. Notice what emerges when we place all these stories side by side. The wilderness is where Moses discovers his mission. The wilderness is where Israel learns dependence. The wilderness is where David learns trust. The wilderness is where Elijah finds renewal. The wilderness is where John receives his voice. The wilderness is where Jesus prepares for his ministry. And suddenly the meaning begins to crystallize. The wilderness is not primarily about punishment. It is about preparation, not abandonment. Preparation, not rejection. Preparation, not the absence of God. Preparation. The same landscape that looks empty from the outside becomes, throughout Scripture, one of the most spiritually significant places in the entire biblical story. And once that pattern becomes visible, the wilderness stops, looking like a dead end. It starts looking like a doorway, a threshold, a place where God does some of his deepest work long before anyone else can see it. So what is the real meaning of the wilderness? After walking through the stories of Moses, Israel, David, Elijah, John, and Jesus, the answer begins to emerge. The wilderness is not simply a place. It is a pattern woven through the entire biblical story. Again and again, God brings people into spaces that feel empty, spaces where familiar supports disappear, spaces where certainty becomes difficult, spaces where control slips through their fingers. And yet, those same places become the settings of some of the deepest transformations in Scripture. That is the paradox. The wilderness often feels like a place where life is being taken away. But in the biblical story, it is frequently the place where something deeper is being given. A new identity, a clearer calling, a stronger trust, a deeper knowledge of God. Perhaps that is why the wilderness appears before so many turning points. Because God is often preparing people for something they cannot yet see. Not by adding more noise, but by removing it. Not by making life easier, but by making his voice clearer. And maybe that is the detail most people miss. The wilderness is rarely where God abandons people. It is where he meets them, sometimes in a burning bush, sometimes in daily manna, sometimes in a cave, sometimes in a whisper, and sometimes in silence itself. Because throughout Scripture, the wilderness is not the end of the story. It is the place between stories, the threshold between what was and what will be. And if that pattern is true, then perhaps the wilderness seasons of our own lives are not always signs that we are lost. Perhaps, as strange as it sounds, they may be signs that God is preparing us for the next chapter, just as he has done from the beginning.